The sound my daughter made when she hit the ice is the sound that still wakes me. It wasn't a scream. It was a short, stunned breath like the world had knocked the air out of her and hadn't bothered to give it back. 1 second. Cassie was standing at the edge of the lake, her hands shoved into the pockets of her winter coat, her shoulders hunched against the wind. The next, she was gone. Just a violent splash. A sharp crack I didn't understand at first. And then the water swallowing her whole. The lake was half frozen that afternoon, the surface a dull gray skin stretched tight over something dark and moving. We had come out there because Chandler said it would be good for her. Fresh air, perspective. A joke, he'd called it. His father, Lawrence, laughed before Cassie even fell. I remember the laugh more clearly than anything else. It was loud, careless. The kind of laugh that assumes there will be no consequences. Cassie! I ran forward, my boots sliding on the ice-crusted dirt, my throat burning as I screamed her name. The cold bit through my coat like teeth. I dropped to my knees at the edge of the lake, reaching out even though there was nothing to grab. The water churned for a moment, then stilled. Chandler didn't move. Lawrence put a hand on his son's shoulder, still chuckling, still shaking his head like this was all a misunderstanding that would sort itself out. She'll be fine, Lawrence said. Kids bounce back. Then they turned, both of them, and walked back to the car. I screamed until my voice broke. I screamed until my chest hurt and my hands went numb. Somewhere behind me, a car door slammed, gravel spit under spinning tires, and then there was only the lake, and the wind, and the terrible silence where my daughter should have been breathing. Before that day, my life had been ordinary in a way I didn't know how to appreciate. I thought stability was something you earned and then kept, like a piece of furniture you dusted once a week and never really looked at again. Cassie was 12 thin as a reed, all elbows and knees, with a habit of chewing on the strings of her hoodie when she was nervous. She had her father's dark hair, but my eyes, the same soft brown that always seemed to be searching for something. She was careful with her feelings, careful with other people's too. The kind of child who apologized when someone else bumped into her. Chandler used to say she was too sensitive. He'd say it with a smile, like it was a harmless observation. I learned early on that Chandler's smiles were rarely harmless. We lived in a house that looked better from the outside than it felt on the inside. White siding, a wide porch we never sat on. Inside, everything was chosen to impress sleek counters, expensive art that didn't say anything. Lawrence Blair's influence was everywhere. He'd helped Chandler with a down payment, helped him into the business, helped him believe he was entitled to more than most people. Lawrence was a man who smelled like cologne and confidence. He shook hands too hard. He looked at you like he was already bored with whatever you were about to say. When he came over, he treated our home like an extension of himself, rearranging chairs, criticizing the coffee, reminding Cassie, always Cassie, that she should stand up straight. Confidence is everything, he'd say, tapping her forehead lightly with one finger. You don't want people thinking you're weak. Cassie would smile politely and glance at me, her eyes asking the question she never said out loud. Why does Grandpa talk like that? Chandler and I had met years before, when I was still working long hours and believing that love was something you proved by enduring. He was charming then, attentive in public, distant in private. I told myself that was normal. I told myself a lot of things. Mornings in our house followed a script. Coffee brewing, toast burning because Chandler liked it dark and forgot it was even in there. Cassie at the counter, swinging her legs as she ate cereal, telling me about a book she was reading or a girl at school who'd been mean for no reason. Chandler would scroll through his phone, half listening, correcting her grammar if she misspoke. People take advantage of mistakes, he'd say. You should know that by now. I'd catch Cassie's eye and shrug slightly, trying to soften the moment. Later, when Chandler wasn't around, I'd kiss the top of her head and tell her she was doing just fine. That words mattered, but so did kindness. She'd nod, but I could see the confusion settle in anyway, like dust. The lake had always been one of Lawrence's favorite places. It sat on land tied to one of his old investments, a stretch of water surrounded by bare trees and memories no one ever talked about. He liked to bring us there on holidays, liked to point out where he used to fish, where deals were made and sealed with handshakes and silence. The day it happened, Lawrence insisted we all go. Build character, he said. Too much screen time makes kids soft. Cassie didn't want to go. I could tell by the way she lingered by the door, tying and retying her boots. I almost told her we could stay home, that she could curl up on the couch with a blanket and her book. Almost. Instead, I followed them. I always did. We stood by the edge of the lake, the air sharp enough to make my eyes water. Cassie hugged her coat around herself. It's cold, she said quietly. That's the point, Chandler replied. Wakes you up. Lawrence grinned. Come on, son. Show her how it's done. I saw Chandler's hand move before my mind caught up. I saw the sudden shove, the surprise on Cassie's face, the way her feet slipped on the icy ground. Time slowed in a way that felt cruel, like the world wanted me to watch every detail. "Chandler, stop!" I started, but the words never landed. Cassie fell. The lake took her, and everything I thought I knew about my life shattered with that first crack of ice. I don't remember how long I knelt there before I saw the fisherman. He came running from down the shore, shouting, his boots pounding against frozen earth. He didn't hesitate. He threw his coat aside and slid into the water with a rope around his waist, his face set with a focus I'll never forget. When he pulled her out, Cassie was limp, her skin pale against the dark wet of her clothes. There was blood at her temple, where she'd hit the ice. I held her as we waited for the ambulance, counting breaths that weren't there yet, whispering promises I didn't know how to keep. At the hospital, everything smelled like antiseptic and fear. Machines beeped. Nurses moved quickly, efficiently, with the calm of people who'd seen worse and knew how fragile hope could be. Cassie survived. That's what people say, like it was simple. She survived, but something in me didn't. As I sat there, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee I couldn't drink, I felt a cold settle in my chest that had nothing to do with the lake. I thought of Chandler's laugh, Lawrence's voice, the way they'd driven away without looking back. I pulled out my phone and scrolled to a name I hadn't called in years. "Silas?" My brother answered on the second ring, his voice rough, surprised. "Audrey?" I didn't cry. I didn't explain. I stared through the glass at my daughter lying still and small in that hospital bed, and I spoke with a calm I didn't recognize as my own. "Do what you do best," I said. And when I hung up, I knew whatever came next would change everything. Silas hadn't changed much since I last saw him, still the same threadbare jacket, the same tired eyes that looked like they'd swallowed more secrets than he wanted to carry. We drifted apart after the scandal, the kind of fall from grace that makes people want to disappear. But I knew his mind was still sharp. And more importantly, I trusted him to find the truth, even if it hurt us both. "I'm on it," he said simply. The days that followed were a blur of sterile hospital corridors and whispered phone calls. Cassie was awake but fragile, her head wrapped in bandages, her small hand clenched tight in mine whenever I sat by her bedside. She didn't say much. I could see the confusion and fear behind her eyes, the way she tried to make sense of the cruel joke that had almost ended her life. Chandler and Lawrence never came to the hospital. Their absence was a presence all its own, a deliberate silence that screamed louder than any apology. Silas dug in fast. His fingers flew across the keyboard of his old laptop as he traced Lawrence Blair's name through old news archives, legal records, and forgotten corners of the internet. It didn't take long before he found the first cracks in the polished surface of the Blair empire. Victor Thorne, a name that had floated just beneath the surface of local gossip for years. Victor had been Lawrence's business partner 2 decades ago, the man everyone said had drowned in this very same lake, an accident the police had ruled. No witnesses, no suspects, just a tragedy buried under years of silence and whispered rumors. Silas's tone when he called me with the news was colder than I expected. "It's no accident, Audrey. Not the way it happened. There are reports of bribes, hush money." Lawrence made sure the truth never came out. I felt the old chills settle deeper in my bones. A cover-up. Lies built on lies. The same lake. The same careless attitude toward human life. "I want to meet him," I said quietly. Silas paused. "You don't have to do this alone." But I did. I needed to see Lawrence Blair again. To look at the man who'd watched my daughter fall and walked away without a second thought. When I confronted him, Lawrence was exactly as I remembered, sharp suit, sharper eyes, the faint scent of expensive tobacco. His smile was polite but empty. "Your daughter's lucky to be alive," I said, steady despite the tremor I felt inside. "Lucky. Yes," he said smoothly. "But life's about risks, Audrey. Sometimes people get hurt." The way he said it, like Cassie was a cost of doing business, was more poisonous than anything else. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't plead. I just told him this wasn't over. Silas worked day and night, piecing together evidence that stretched back over 20 years. The story he uncovered was worse than I imagined. Victor Thorne had been a man who trusted Lawrence too much. When Victor started asking questions about their joint investments, money that disappeared, and deals made in shadows, Lawrence grew impatient. One night, Victor went fishing alone on the lake and never came back. Official reports said he slipped, fell, drowned. No foul play. But the papers Silas found told a different story, one of threats, payments to keep quiet, and a tangled web of greed that had stayed hidden until now. I watched as the truth peeled away the layers of the Blair family's perfect image. Chandler, too, was part of this tangled mess, grew up believing that power meant control, that cruelty was a tool, not a sin. For Cassie's sake, for my own, I had to make sure the world knew what Lawrence Blair really was. Silas's bombshell expose went live on a quiet Thursday morning. the headline sharp and unyielding. Lawrence Blair, the man behind 2 drownings and a family's silence. The story spread fast. It hit the newsstands, social media, every corner of our town. People who'd admired the Blair name began to ask questions. Lawyers called. Police reopened cold cases. The foundation of the Blair Empire began to crumble under the weight of truth. Chandler was the first to fall. Suspended from his position at the company, stripped of his privileges. Lawrence tried to maintain his composure, but the cracks in his armor were visible to everyone. I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching a family destroyed, but there was relief. A hard, bitter relief. Because for the first time since Cassie's fall into that icy lake, I could breathe without choking on anger. The days after the exposé were a strange kind of silence. The kind that follows a storm when the wind has died down but the air still tastes like thunder. Cassie was still in the hospital. Her head was healing, but the faraway look in her eyes stayed a fragile mix of fear and disbelief. She wouldn't talk much about what happened, and I didn't push. Instead, I sat with her, holding her hand, tracing the lines of her fingers like they were a map we'd both need to follow to safety. Every time the phone rang, I flinched. The calls from Chandler's lawyers, the calls from the news, even my own voice answering questions I wasn't sure I had the strength to face. But then there was Silas, always steady, always a step ahead. He showed up at the hospital with files and notes, quietly explaining what would happen next. His presence was a strange comfort, like having a lighthouse in the fog. "You did the right thing," he told me once, as Cassie slept. "I just wanted the truth," I said, but the words felt hollow. Truth had a way of breaking things. Not just the people who deserved it, but the ones caught in the middle. Lawrence Blair didn't take the fall quietly. His lawyers tried to smear Silas, calling him a disgraced journalist desperate for a comeback. They threatened lawsuits, tried to buy silence with the same cold money that had covered up Victor's death. But the evidence was too strong. The town's whispers turned to accusations, then to demands for justice. And Chandler? He stopped returning my calls. Stopped showing up where I knew he would be. I heard through the grapevine that he'd been arrested on charges related to Cassie's assault. Reckless endangerment, negligence, assault. The coldness with which he pushed Cassie into the lake. His laughter. It was no longer something to be hidden. At the hospital, Cassie started to come back to herself. One afternoon, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "Mom, why did Grandpa do that?" I didn't have a ready answer. How could I? Some questions don't have easy answers. But I told her, because sometimes, people think power gives them the right to hurt others. But that's a lie. Her eyes filled with tears. But there was also something else resolve, like the first flicker of a flame in the dark. After a few weeks, Cassie was discharged. We left the hospital quietly, like ghosts reclaiming the world they thought they'd lost. The house where we had lived, the one filled with cold silences and half-truths, felt more like a prison than home. We didn't go back. Instead, we moved to a small apartment in the city, the kind of place that smelled like fresh paint and hope. It was nothing like the Blair mansion, but it was ours. Simple, real. Cassie took her time unpacking. She arranged her books on the shelves, placed a small plant on the windowsill. She started sleeping with the light on, and sometimes, just before she fell asleep, she'd ask me to tell her stories where people who got hurt could still find their way back. I found work nearby, a job that let me keep my hours flexible. I wanted to rebuild, not just for Cassie, but for myself. Every night, before we turned off the lights, I'd sit by the window and watch the city lights flicker. I thought about how fragile life was, how quickly it could change, but also how strong we could become when forced to face the darkness. Silas kept in touch, sharing updates on the Blair trials and the slow, messy process of justice. There was no grand victory, no triumphant speeches, just the steady unraveling of lies, the quiet power of truth. I didn't hate Chandler or Lawrence anymore. Hate is heavy, and I had learned that carrying it only weighed me down. Instead, I chose to remember the lesson Cassie had already begun to understand. People with power sometimes forget what it means to be human. But the rest of us, the ones who are broken and bruised, we have a chance to be better. One evening, Cassie asked me, "Mom, do you think Grandpa will ever say he's sorry?" I looked at her small face, honest and hopeful, and I said, "Some people never do, but that doesn't mean we have to wait for their forgiveness to find peace." She nodded slowly, the kind of nod that holds a world of understanding beyond her years. We have been through the worst kind of winter, but I believe spring is coming. Not just for us, but for anyone who has ever been pushed under ice and left to fight for breath. The Blair Empire's fall wasn't quick or clean. It was more like watching a sprawling mansion slowly crack and crumble foundation, weakened by years of rot hidden beneath the surface. The public didn't just hear about the drowning of Victor Thorne. They heard about the system that protected Lawrence Blair for decades. The police officers who looked the other way. The politicians with pockets lined by Blair money. The corporate boardrooms where silence was bought and sold like currency. Silas's report didn't just tell a story, it exposed an entire culture of entitlement and impunity. I kept a low profile during all of it, but the news followed me. People whispered at the grocery store. Some stared when they saw me with Cassie. Fragile but healing. Others avoided my eyes altogether, maybe uncomfortable with what the truth demanded. At night, I lay awake, listening to Cassie's quiet breathing beside me, wondering how many more families had suffered in silence under the Blair name. And yet, I never regretted the choice to speak out. Because sometimes, justice isn't about vengeance. It's about shining a light so bright that no darkness can hide. Lawrence Blair was arrested a few weeks after Silas's article went viral. The charges were serious conspiracy, bribery, and obstruction of justice related to Victor Thorne's death. The local district attorney who had once refused to reopen the case now pushed it forward with determination. Chandler, too, faced his own reckoning. The assault charges related to Cassie's fall were just the beginning. His reckless behavior, his part in the family's corrupt dealings, and his cruelty came under scrutiny. The man who had once smiled like he owned the world now seemed smaller, diminished by his own choices. What surprised me most wasn't the arrests, it was the silence from their supporters. The people who had once cheered them on disappeared. Their wealth and influence couldn't shield them from the truth. One afternoon, I met Silas at a quiet cafe not far from our apartment. The air smelled like fresh coffee and rain. We sat across from each other, the weight of everything we'd uncovered settling between us. "You did good," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I couldn't have done it without you," I replied. We talked about the future, about Cassie's recovery, about the slow process of healing that stretched out ahead of us. Silas wanted to keep digging, to find other stories buried beneath the surface. I told him to be careful. He smiled that tired smile. "Truth isn't always safe, Audrey, but it's the only thing worth risking for." I nodded. Somewhere in all the chaos, I realized that family wasn't just blood. It was the people who stood with you when the world wanted to tear you apart. Back at our apartment, Cassie was drawing quietly at the kitchen table, her hair falling across her face. I watched her for a moment, the sunlight catching the strands like threads of gold. "How do you feel?" I asked softly. She looked up, eyes bright with a mix of vulnerability and strength. "Like I'm alive," she said. It was the most honest thing she'd said since the lake. I reached across and squeezed her hand, grateful for the second chance we'd been given. "The lesson I want to leave with you is this. Sometimes, the people we trust most can hurt us the deepest. Sometimes, justice takes time longer than we want, harder than we imagine. But the truth, when finally spoken, can set us free. If you're holding on to a secret or living in the shadow of someone else's cruelty, remember this. You don't have to carry it alone. There is strength in speaking out, in demanding the world see what's real." Cassie and I found our way back from a darkness I wouldn't wish on anyone. We rebuilt with nothing but truth in each other. And maybe that's enough. The hardest part wasn't the legal battles or the public scrutiny. It was the quiet moments alone with Cassie, when the weight of everything pressed down on us both. She didn't just need to heal physically. She needed to reclaim the parts of herself that had been drowned in fear and silence. One evening, a few weeks after we moved into the apartment, Cassie stood by the window watching the city lights flicker. I sat beside her, waiting for her to speak. Finally, she said, "Mom, do you think I'll ever be the same?" Her voice was barely above a whisper, fragile like a thread about to break. I took a deep breath, searching for the right words. "No," I said honestly. "Not the same, but stronger. Different. And sometimes, different is better." She looked at me then, really looked, like she was trying to understand what that meant. We started therapy, a slow process of unpacking memories and fears. It was painful, but it was also where Cassie began to find her voice again. She talked about the lake, about Chandler's laughter, about the cold that seeped into her bones. "I'm scared," she told me once, tears slipping down her cheeks. "But I don't want to be scared anymore." Watching her fight to reclaim her life was humbling. I realized that strength isn't about never falling, it's about standing up, again and again, even when your legs shake. Meanwhile, Silas kept working. His articles exposed more cracks in the Blair network, hidden deals, silenced employees, families caught in webs of deceit. His name was finally cleared in the eyes of some. And even though the scars of his past remained, he walked taller. We weren't interested in revenge. We didn't want to break them, only to become broken ourselves. Instead, we wanted change, accountability, a future where Cassie, and kids like her, wouldn't have to fear the people who were supposed to protect them. I often thought about Chandler, what he'd become, and what he'd lost. The arrogance that pushed Cassie into that lake came from a place of entitlement, a belief that power excused cruelty. Watching him unravel wasn't satisfying. It was a somber reminder of how far a person could fall when they forgot their humanity. One chilly autumn afternoon, I took Cassie to the lake, the same lake where everything changed. I wanted her to face it on her own terms. The ice was thin in places, and the wind was sharper than I expected. We didn't go near the water's edge. Instead, we sat on a bench overlooking the still gray surface, wrapped in blankets, the silence between us full but comfortable. "I'm not ready to forgive them," Cassie said quietly. "That's okay," I told her. "Forgiveness isn't a requirement. It's a gift you give yourself when you're ready." She nodded and looked out over the water. "Maybe one day I'll understand why people like Grandpa and Chandler do what they do," she said. "But I don't have to be like them." I smiled through the chill in my bones. "No, you don't." We left the lake that day feeling a little lighter. Our journey wasn't over, not by a long shot. Healing takes time. Justice isn't always neat. But we had found something more important than fear or anger. Hope. And sometimes, hope is enough to keep you afloat. The Blair trials moved forward quietly but decisively. The courtroom was a far cry from the cold boardrooms and private jets that had once surrounded Lawrence and Chandler. Instead of power and privilege, the walls echoed with testimonies, voices of those who had been silenced for too long. Cassie didn't attend the hearings. I made sure of that. Some wounds are too fresh. Some battles too heavy for a 12-year-old. But I was there, every day, listening, watching justice unfold. Slow and imperfect, but real. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank statements showing bribes, witnesses stepping forward, even former employees who had long feared retaliation finally speaking out. Lawrence's arrogance cracked under pressure. Chandler's defense crumbled. When the verdicts came down, I wasn't there. I was at home with Cassie, holding her hand, watching her build paper boats and set them afloat on a small fountain in the courtyard of our apartment building. The boats bobbed gently on the water, fragile but moving forward. Lawrence Blair was sentenced to prison for multiple counts of conspiracy and manslaughter. Chandler faced years behind bars for reckless endangerment and assault. The Blair empire, once untouchable, was no more. But as the legal dust settled, I realized something else. The hardest part wasn't the fall of the Blairs. It was the rise of our own lives after the wreckage. I had to learn how to be a mother again, how to protect without sheltering, how to listen without drowning in fear. Cassie was learning too. Slowly, hesitantly, she began to reclaim her laughter, the one that didn't feel forced or borrowed. We found small joys in quiet moments. Baking cookies that didn't burn, watching old movies wrapped in blankets, walks through the neighborhood where no one knew our story. One afternoon, Cassie turned to me, her face bright with a shy smile. "Mom, can we get a dog?" I laughed, the sound light and full of promise. "Let's do it." In the evenings, when the city lights flickered to life, I often sat by the window reflecting on the journey that had brought us here. I thought about how close we had come to losing everything, how one cruel prank could have ended Cassie's life. But more than that, I thought about the power of truth, the way it can cut through lies, break chains, and set people free. I wasn't the same woman I had been before the lake. I was stronger, quieter in some ways, fiercer in others. And Cassie, well, she was becoming her own person. A survivor with a story that refused to be silenced. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this story, it's this. The people who hurt us don't get to write our endings. We do. We have the power to choose how we respond, to find courage when the world feels darkest, to hold on to hope when everything seems lost. And sometimes, that choice is the bravest thing we'll ever make. Rebuilding wasn't a sudden change. It was a series of small, deliberate steps, a slow, sometimes shaky dance towards something resembling peace. Cassie blossomed in the quiet. School became a place of discovery rather than fear. She joined a local art club, where her drawings spilled out emotions she couldn't always put into words. Watching her pour color onto paper, I saw strength bloom in places I thought were broken beyond repair. I found work as a freelance editor for a small publishing house. The job wasn't glamorous, but it gave me time. Time to be present, to heal, to breathe. I learned to appreciate the smell of fresh paper, the soft tap of keys, the rhythm of deadlines met and stories shaped. Our apartment grew warm with little things: a new rug Cassie picked out, plants on the windowsill that needed watering, the soft hum of a playlist we both loved. Some nights, we'd sit together on the worn couch, wrapped in a blanket, sharing stories. Not just the hard ones, but the silly ones, the hopeful ones. One night, Cassie looked at me and said, "Mom, do you think we're really free now?" I thought about the lake, about Lawrence and Chandler, about the long shadows they'd cast over our lives. "We are," I said. "Free isn't just about what's behind us. It's about what we choose to carry forward. She smiled. And for the first time in a long while, that smile wasn't touched by fear. Healing didn't mean forgetting. It meant learning to live with what happened without letting it define us. I learned to forgive myself for not seeing the warning signs, for trusting the wrong people, for not protecting Cassie the way I wanted to. Cassie learned that her worth wasn't tied to what others thought or did to her. She was more than a victim. She was a fighter, a dreamer, a survivor. Our relationship grew deeper, rooted in honesty and trust. I listened more, held her tighter, let her know every day that she was loved beyond measure. Sometimes, when the nights were quiet, I thought about Silas. His relentless pursuit of truth had given us a chance to rewrite our story. Our bond, once frayed, had been mended by shared purpose and pain. We promised to stay connected, to protect each other in ways we hadn't before. Looking back now, I realized the lake was more than a place of tragedy. It was the turning point that forced us to confront lies, to face betrayal, and ultimately, to find strength. I won't pretend the scars have disappeared. They haven't. But scars are proof of survival. They are reminders that even when broken, we can heal. And that healing is where real freedom begins. When I think back to that day at the lake, the cold splash, the silence that followed, I still feel the weight of it. But what lingers more is the quiet strength Cassie and I found in each other after everything broke. Life doesn't always give us the endings we want. Sometimes, it hands us pain wrapped in betrayal. But within that pain, there is a choice. To let it consume us, or to let it teach us. I chose to fight not with anger or vengeance, but with truth. I chose to believe that exposing the darkness could bring light, not just for us, but for others who might be trapped in similar shadows. Cassie's courage reminds me every day that healing isn't linear, and freedom isn't perfect. It's messy, slow, and deeply human. So I ask you, if you were in my shoes, watching someone you love nearly lost to cruelty, would you have the strength to seek the truth? To face the consequences and rebuild? Would you have done what I did? Tell me your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories matter. They remind us all that we are not alone. If this story touched you, please consider subscribing for more real stories from voices like ours. Together, we can find hope in the hardest places and strength in the shared human experience. Thank you for listening.